just about to get started, but I see a lot of people are jumping on the call. So let's just wait maybe 10, 15 seconds.
It's like that moment where everyone's shuffling in, moving around their wine glasses, getting settled in their seats.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Vero, you've got your glass ready to go, I see.
Okay, I'm just going to check one thing. Okay, I think we'll get started. I can see that we are rapidly getting more and more participants. Welcome again to the i4C 2020 virtual weekend. We had an amazing session this morning as part of the School of Cool at Home edition, and we are excited to bring you the second session this afternoon. Before I introduce the session and hand it over to our moderator and introduce the panelists, I just want to do a brief thank you again to the i4C board and everyone that helped put this whole weekend together and make these sessions possible. And in addition to that, the sponsors of the entire weekend, which is VQA and Wine Country Ontario, the LCBO, the Grape Growers of Ontario, Wine and Spirits Magazine, Black River Cheese, and Arterra. I also wanted to mention that this specific session was a partnership between Wines of New Zealand and Chablis, and also VQA Wines of Ontario. So there's really a focus on the three regions from that partnership. So thank you for the collaboration for today's session. From a logistical perspective, we want to remind everyone that when you're using Zoom, as most of you are probably experts, to use both the chat really just for having a little bit of conversation amongst yourselves and share your thoughts. But if you are actually wanting to ask a specific question, please use the Q&A, and we will check those at the end to ask the panelists questions. So please feel free to do that anytime, and we'll look at those at the very end. So next, I'd like to remind everyone that the Q&A will go at the very end. The whole session will be recorded. We will be sharing all of this through all of our social channels. And if you have any questions or want to know more about what's happening over the weekend, tomorrow and tomorrow evening, there's a taste of Chardonnay, toast to Chardonnay, sorry, and an at-home tasting experience that people can get involved in by sharing their own experiences. So I'd like to welcome back John Sabo, who has been a long-standing supporter to the i4C, having moderated a number of panels over the years. And he's in Toronto. And so he'll be moderating the session. And again, I said this earlier this morning, I won't go into detail about everyone on the panel. John will certainly go ahead and introduce everybody. But we are excited that this is an all-Canadian panel. We have Treve Ring in British Columbia. We have Brad Royale, who's in Alberta. And we have Véronique Rivest, who is in Quebec. So many thanks for everyone from across the country, and I'm going to pass this over to John to get started, and I'll be back later.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Magdalena, and happy 10th anniversary, i4C. I'm happy that I haven't been fully and permanently relegated to moderator emeritus status at the Cool of School. Thrilled to be back here with this terrific panel. Have to say, I do miss the 300 plus faces in the ballroom at the White Oak. So it was a pretty intense room, pretty charged. Great to see so many wine professionals gathering together. But I have to say that the more of these Zoom sessions I do, the more I kind of like the format. I mean, it allows all of us, my good friends from across the country, to join us here today. And I see that we've got some folks tuning in from many different continents. So this has truly become a global, international, cool climate Chardonnay celebration. I hope you all caught that session this morning with 4 terrific speakers. I know I was jotting down lots of sentences that I plan to steal for future articles and other broadcasts from four really important voices in the world of wine. And we're going to pick up, I think, on a few of the threads that they brought up. They were the more intellectual, philosophical side of things. We're going to get down into some of the more nitty-gritty. And in fact, this session is about that age-old debate, that topic that never seems to die, how to define cool climates. Though I have to say, Matt Kramer did a pretty terrific job of trying to kill it right off the top when he said, cool climate is almost meaningless. Did you all catch that? He did actually say that at an international cool climate Chardonnay celebration. But let's not forget, he's also the gentleman who on the inaugural i4C, it was most remembered for his plea to winemakers to grow more Gamay. That was another famous Matt Kramer moment there. All right, I've taken him totally out of context. My apologies, Matt. But what we've done here is assembled a panel of pretty sharp minds that kind of transcend boundaries. So we've got a whole bunch of different skill sets here. We've got wine bar owners, we've got consultants, we've got writers, we've got vineyard owners, we've got people who wear a number of different hats. And the idea was to kind of cross that bridge between real life experience, market on the floor, dealing with customers, communicating with customers, and throwing a little bit of scientific background into it. So we're going to be debating a number of topics surrounding cool. But let me first reintroduce the panelists in a little bit more detail, starting with my dear friend Treve Ring, all the way from Victoria, BC. Hopefully those wild squirrels in your backyard leave you alone for the next hour or so.
We'll see.
Those of you who don't know Treve, she's a prolific writer. She works with Anthony Gismondi on wine, with Jamie Good at Wine Anorak. She's written for Meinigers, Fine World of Fine Wine, and countless others. Also a longtime judge at the Wine Line National Wine Awards of Canada. So welcome, Treve.
Thank you. Pleasure.
And moving over to our neighbors in Quebec, actually just across the river in Gatineau, Véronique Rivest. I think probably everyone tuned in here will be familiar with her, Vice Sommelier World Champion, owner of Soif Wine Bar, that place that you just get thirsty thinking about the name Soif, don't you, Vero? She's a writer, broadcaster, educator, and notorious fountain jumper as well. I guess your fountain jumping has been put on hold temporarily, but you shall be back. And then Brad Royale, all the way from Calgary, Alberta. Brad is a consultant with a long list of clients in hospitality. Though if you're out there and you're looking for a consultant right now, he's happy to take your call. He's also the owner of Kitten Swish Micro Negociant. And if you're not familiar with Kitten Swish wines, find yourself a bottle. They're very progressive, very cutting edge wines. He's even bottled a Hungarian Cake Francos, just to give you an idea of how far he will go to find weird and interesting wine. So welcome, friends. Glad to have you on board here. So you know, audience, how you're going to do the Q&A. No really other housekeeping matters to mention. Otherwise, keep your cell phones on. We don't really care. You're muted. And as for emergency exits and washrooms, you are on your own. Other than that, let's get on with the nitty gritty here. So I've asked each of the panelists to defend or condemn, debating style, one of the classic parameters of cool climates. So we want to get to the heart of what is most important. How should we really define cool climates, even though they're meaningless, apparently, and what it is about these Chardonnays that make them so cool. What are the characteristics of cool? So I've asked Treve Ring to discuss growing degree days, that Winkler scale that many of us are familiar with. So that's going to be our starting point. Also soil color and temperature, which is something that we discuss a little less often, but is that important? We shall soon see. Vero is going to talk to us about altitude and latitude. And Brad is going to talk to us about things like diurnal shift, risk of frost, winter damage. Are these important characteristics of a cool climate? Will that enter our definition? And I'm going to tell you a little bit about length of growing season and sunlight hours, cloud cover, and wind. Who talks about wind? But we're going to talk a little bit about wind today. All right, so that's how it's going to roll out. In a minute, I will pass things over to the panelists. Let me just give you a little bit of background detail to set the stage, as it were, and to repeat what I'm sure everybody out there already knows. We can consider that any given grape variety, any particular cultivar will produce its highest quality and most consistent wines in a climate zone that allows I'm going to call them the 4 ripeness clocks, which are all running in a grapevine at the same time, but at different rates in a climate that allows these 4 clocks to kind of synchronize and all strike midnight, you know, reach that spot that we're going to try and define at the same time. And these clocks are sugar accumulation, acid respiration or ripening, if you want to call it that, phenolic ripeness, that kind of ambiguous topic, but we know that secondary metabolites, you know, these compounds are responsible for the majority of sensory characteristics of wine, critical to good quality wine. And we're going to talk a little bit about fruit character, which is for me the 4th clock, something that we discuss frequently in quartermaster sommelier style tastings. Fruit character being the one thing that you can't really modify as a winemaker. And by fruit character, I mean, how does that fruit look? Is it fresh? Is it ripe? Is it super ripe? Is it overripe? Is it jammy? The character of the fruit, not the actual fruit itself. Take a peach, it can be green, it can be perfectly ripe, it can be just a little bit overripe, or it could be peach pie. All peach, but different fruit character. So for me, fruit character, maybe the panelists will agree or disagree, one of the critical defining characteristics of a climate, and in our case, cool climate here. All right, so extremes of any kind are really bad. And as a basic starting point for just to throw out some numbers, because we're going to have to do that, and Andrew already mentioned it off the top in his keynote this morning, examining where fine wine is grown around the world, you're looking at quality wine production being limited to zones that have a range of temperature, and these are average temperatures, mean temperatures in the growing season, so the 7 months of growing season, somewhere between 13 and 21 degrees. Those of you tuning in this morning would have heard that Andrew said anything less than 16 degrees, he would consider cool climate. It's functionally about the same as a growing degree day calculation. It's just a little easier to actually calculate. And all of our regions in question today fall in this range. So we're going to be leveraging some wines, of course. That's an important part of this. We all have slightly different wines, but we're going to be looking at wines from a country. We have New Zealand. We're going to be looking at wines from a region or a province, Ontario, naturally. And we're going to be looking at wines from Chablis. And we're not going to look at the specifics of the producer so much as use these wines as our starting point or our end point or our definitions we're going to bring out along the way. All right, so that's how it is. Hopefully you all have a glass or 2 or more of some cool climate Chardonnay there, and you can taste along with us. And just to, again, back to the baseline, looking at, let's say, a comparative of a couple of different grapes. Look at Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Cabernet. That's familiar varieties for most folks out there. Pinot Noir is typically grown in regions that span from cool to that lower intermediate. So I'm talking 14 to 16 degrees. Places like Bourgogne or the Willamette Valley, Ontario, Prince Edward County, for example. Some really cool places like Tamar Valley in Tasmania, or one of the warmest, Russian River. But we're looking at a 2-degree difference. But that 2 degrees makes for an amazing variation in wine styles, as we are familiar with Pinot Noir. At that 14 or slightly lower, you get the fine, lean, high acid. At the 16, you start to get into much riper. And outside of that tiny little range, the results are not very good, to be perfectly frank. You get either only sparkling wine at the lower end, or you get something more akin to Merlot or Syrah when you get into really warm zones. Cabernet, only in those warm areas, 16 to 20 is about the range that works well. That's Bordeaux to Napa. Whereas Chardonnay, as we all know, is probably the most versatile cool climate variety that we'll be discussing, and it spans a much broader range. We're going to be focusing on the lower end, of course. All right, so that brings us to growing degree day. So first of all, Treve, I want you to remind us what a growing degree day is and then how you calculate it. And after that, I'm going to ask you a slightly more pointed question.
Okay, so growing degree days, the most commonly used system for temperature-based metric to assess site suitability for grape production. But it's not always the most valid, as we're going to see. So growing degree days, Amarino Winkler's heat summation system from the 1940s. And it's calculated by measuring the mean temperature for the month and subtracting 10 degrees, which is the base temperature required for vine growth. Then you multiply that result by the number of days in the month. So, for example, if the average temperature for June is 15, 15 minus 10 is 5, times 30 days in June, the growing degree days for that month is 150. you total all of the months of the growing season, usually about 7 months, and that'll give you the growing degree days for that year.
Or for the growing season.
Yeah.
Precisely. Okay, great. That's all very clear. So here's my question for you. Debating style, Treve Ring, like democracy in the eyes of Winston Churchill, which he called the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that we've tried from time to time. Be it resolved that growing degree day calculations and the Winkler scale that you mentioned in particular is the worst way to measure cool climate, except for all the other ways in which cool climates are measured. But would you argue for or against that?
I don't believe it's the strongest way. I wouldn't really say it's the worst way. There are some pros to growing degree days. It can make for some useful comparisons. Could you pull up that chart if you can?
Of course.
Sabo. So the growing degree days of Prince Edward County, for example, is 1250, which is very similar to that of Bourgogne in France, and same as Chablis in 2019, it was about the same, 1315 growing degree days. And when you take into consideration the soils, the limestone-based soils, a cooling hibernation winter, you can see why Chardonnay and Pinot Noir makes a lot of sense in Prince Edward County, as it does obviously in Bourgogne and Chardonnay and Chablis, for sure. So, you know, useful comparisons that way on a generalized scale. But there's a lot of limits to growing degree days as well, because the relationship between vine growth and temperature is not linear. It is only taking temperature into account. As we're going to talk a little bit more today with some of the other panelists, there's a lot of other factors that are equally as important as temperature. So you can just see on the chart, I've highlighted a few places in Canada, based with other regions around the world, and you can kind of see growing degree days. And this is a rolling average as well. That's one thing, you know, climate change thing, vintage variation, especially in fringe regions, cool climate regions is a really big thing. So this is an average, these numbers here. So as I mentioned, it can be sort of useful. It can lump areas together, but there's a lot more precise scales that take other things into consideration, like the latitude temperature index. Vero is going to be talking about latitude, but when you're comparing cooler, less continental regions like New Zealand, for example, latitude plays a big role. So there is a latitude temperature index, which factors in the region and therefore the length of the day, which is important. There's also indexes that look at the number of frost-free days, because obviously if you have a lot of frost blitzing out the beginning of a season, doesn't matter if you have sunlight hours, your vines are not going to progress as far and as strongly as they would without the frost. And Bradley's going to talk a little bit more about that. And of course, grape varieties are all very different, and the way that they absorb and use sunlight is different between each variety. Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, planted in the exact same vineyard, are not going to react the same with the same amount of growing degree days. And even clones of Chardonnay planted in the same vineyard will not react the same. Grapes that are early budding are going to have more beneficial effect from sunlight hours, because they're going to be producing more leaves. And those leaves act as, you know, powerhouses for the plant. And so they're going to have a greater effect than varieties that bud late, even if they're planted in the same vineyard with the same growing degree days. So, you know, as long as you keep those factors in check and keep it in mind, it is a tool, but I don't think it's the most useful tool. And of course, it doesn't take into consideration climate at all. Look at a place like Okanagan Valley and Bordeaux. They both have similar growing degree days, 1400-ish, but their climates are completely different. So it's one factor.
But a pretty limiting factor by the sounds of it from your argument. And I'm looking at these numbers here. I always raise an eyebrow when I see the Napa number there. That's actually less than the Niagara Peninsula. But we know that clearly the climates are radically different, and the Cabernet from the Niagara Peninsula has nothing to do with the Cabernet from Napa. So I suppose, although Emerine and Winkler did their best to give a general indication of what might work where and in what zone, it's a very simplified way of looking at a place, and inadequate in my opinion. What do we think Brad Royale, your opinion on this?
I think it's an easy way, certainly back through the 40s and 50s when viticulture areas were emerging, certainly, and we needed to find maybe just some ideas as to a base reality. Yeah, so I think probably, early days, it was maybe a bit more useful than it is now, because now we actually have studies, we have viticulture area in all of those areas, where early on it was maybe used as a trial method. Will this work possibly here? Yes, we can look at those numbers and maybe see a correlation between this and a particular type of quality or a particular type of result that would come through. I think it is really just one of a wide variety of things you would have to look at now currently, especially.
Véronique?
Well, it's like you said, John, I always find it very surprising to look, those numbers on their own are right. I mean, Geisenheim is amongst the highest, right? Many more growing degree days than Napa. So yeah, it's a very limiting element, I find. Definitely useful in some aspects, as Brad pointed out, but impossible to draw any general conclusions from just that, even on the, maybe on the capacity of growing vines in climates that have those growing degree days, but definitely not in terms of style.
All right, well, let's shelve growing degree days then. We'll tuck it in, we'll pull it out, maybe if we run out of other things to look at, but let's move on. Let's talk about something that gets a lot less discussion time, and that is soil temperature and soil color. So Treve, what can you report on from your research? How does that affect?
Soil temperature and color, I mean, the soil color is influenced by the moisture content, the mineral composition, and the organic matter in the soil. And so I think the soil color temperature has a lot more to do with the end result of what the flavor profile and structural profile of the wine you're trying to produce, rather than its suitability for, say, cool climate viticulture. The temperature potential of a soil has to do with its heat retaining capacity. Does it hold on to heat? Or its heat reflective characteristics? Is it going to reflect and radiate warmth back up to the vines? So if you're planting in a fringe area, a cooler climate area, maybe those are things that you want to take into consideration when you're making your planting. But I don't think it has much to do with defining cool climate viticulture, cool climate wines.
All right, I'm going to just flash up a little graph that I uncovered that tells a pretty interesting tale, I have to say. Can you all see that? By the way, you can move the camera out of the way if we're blocking any of the information on the graph here. This is not New Zealand, Ontario, or Chablis. This is in the Columbia Valley in Washington State, but that's the only comparison I could find of ambient air, ground surface, subsurface, and cluster or berry temperature on two different soil types. You have grass, right? So no exposed earth at all. And in this case, some basalt cobble. So very dark, heat retaining stone. And you can see some pretty dramatic differences in, not so much in the ambient air temperature as you would expect, but the ground surface, the grass much cooler than the stones. That's logical. And I tell you why I think that's important. And again, any viticulturalists, winemakers out there who would like to weigh in on the chat box, we'd love to hear from you. But heat radiates up into the canopy, but not only there, but also it radiates down into the soil. And as we remember from Chemistry 101, reactions happen more quickly at higher temperatures. So you would have to presume that there is a little bit more chemical or more active chemical activity, absorption through the root system, going on in a really hot soil as opposed to a really cool soil. And you can see that subsurface, also quite a dramatic difference, 3 degrees, which for a grapevine is enormous. And even in the clusters themselves. And I think I'm going to argue a little bit later on that berry temperature and cluster temperature is a pretty key factor in defining cool climates. So I'm gonna put a thumbs up for soil type, color, heat retention as I think one of the important characteristics. Any other thoughts from my fellow panelists on this one? We're getting a little too deep into the details, missing the beauty, missing the enduring loveliness, as Andrew put it this morning, very poetically.
I think that's a great slide to show the intensity of soil. We talk about soil a lot, and we have a hard time, I think, defining how soil flavors a wine or infuse into a wine the nuance. But that slide does a great job of showing exactly how reactionary soil is immediately to viticulture, in the way that grapes would develop, canopy would develop, and sustained duration of ripening and activity within the vine. I mean, that's directly related to that heat retention and heat release within a soil. I think that shows a great importance to soil type in viticulture.
I happen to be tasting a little Chablis, literally a petit Chablis here from La Roche. You've been to Chablis, or you've seen photos of it. You saw a photo of it this morning, and just how remarkably stark white those soils are. I mean, it's essentially pure limestone on the surface, and the stones themselves don't get anywhere near as hot as those dark basalt cobalts would. You get reflective light, but I'm going to steal another sentence here from Andrew. We can talk about light without heat. So you get the photosynthetic side of light, the active photosynthesis that occurs because of light, but you don't have the accompanying heat. And I would like to submit that for a place like Chablis with really bright white soils, that is a factor in the cool climate. Obviously, lots of other things come into play, but I think it's an important one. Anyone else drinking light without heat wine out there?
Oh, yes, little petit Chablis here as well.
And then we can talk about soil moisture retention too. I was talking with Shiraz Motiar from Malivoire the other day, and he was talking about the difference between the denser clays on the bench, how they retain a lot more. We're in Niagara here, by the way, sorry. Denser clays on the Niagara escarpment on the bench that retain more moisture and are cooler. So the vines are later to start in the morning, they're later to start at the beginning of the season, and it overall gives a cooler feel. And you often hear winemakers refer to the heavier clay soils being cooler soils versus the free draining gravels being much quicker to warm, or those sandy soils that warm up quite quickly. So I'm going to put that on the other side of the shelf there. Treve, would you allow me to do that? On the useful, let's retain that as part of our potential definition. All right. If we are ready to move on, Vero, I'm going to turn it over to you, and let's chat a little bit about altitude and latitude. And as we've discussed before, we know that latitude controls the amount of solar radiation, and that's just simply a physical reality of where you are on the planet and your angle towards the sun. It controls seasonal variation. It controls the length of the day. So it's a pretty important thing. And most textbooks you find will tell you that as you go up 100 meters or so, your average temperature drops by about 1 degree. So my position to you is that you can argue one way or another, be it resolved that considering their permanent, unalterable, and absolute nature, altitude and latitude are the supreme determining factors for cool climates. Are you for or against this?
Totally agree. It's actually everything you were saying before. I was taking, okay, this is latitude. It all comes back to that. Obviously, I don't think any one of us here today is going to argue that one thing only defines cool climate, right? But the more I thought about it, the more and we tend to kind of dismiss latitude because, you know, it's that very basic thing. One of the first things you learn when you start learning about wine, that vine growth is possible between the 30th and the 50th parallel, right? Both north and south. But the more I was digging, the more I was realizing that everything we're talking about, even you were talking about the temperature of the grape cluster, right? Well, where does the heat come from? It's all dependent, the growing degree days, the temperature of the clusters or of the soils, or is initially defined by where you are latitude-wise, right? We're trying to define what cool climate is. And so let's split it up in very general terms, right? There's cool climate, there's moderate, and there's warm, right? If we want to define cool climate, what is climate, right? Climate, in again, that very general sense, is defined mostly by latitude. Latitude will determine, like you said, the insolation, right? So the amount of sun radiation you get, and the period of time when you get the sun, right? So the amount of sun radiation you get, and the period of time when you get the sun, right? So the amount of sun radiation you get, and the period of time when you get the sun, right? So the amount of sun radiation you get, and the period of time when you get the sun, right? So the amount of sun radiation you get, and the period of time when you get the sun, right? So the amount of sun radiation you get, and the period of time when you get the sun, right? So the amount of sun radiation you get, and the period of time when you get the sun, right? So the amount of sun radiation you get, and the period of time when you get the sun, right? So the amount of sun radiation you get, and the period of time when you get the sun, right? So the amount of sun radiation you get, and the period of time when you get the sun, right? So the amount of sun radiation you get, and the period of time when you get the sun, right? So the amount of sun radiation you get, and the period of time when you get the sun, right? So the amount of sun radiation you get, and the period of time when you get the sun, right? So the amount of sun radiation you get, and the period of time when you get the sun, right? So the amount of sun radiation you get, and the period of time when sun, you know, how long, the seasonality. And that basically influences everything else. So I think there's a really, really strong point to be made for, of course, latitude in itself is not sufficient. It's not, because I wouldn't tell anybody, okay, you've got a piece of land at on the 35th parallel, perfect. You fall within 30 and 50, plant a vineyard. It's going to be perfect. Obviously not, right? But I think it's kind of your starting block. Grapevines will thrive mostly in places that have climates with a long, warm summer and, you know, cold winters. That's very much defined by latitude. It was kind of funny in the very beginning. Yeah, so you brought up that famous, right? I think we've all seen that at one point.
I remember that the textbook, the first textbook I ever read on wine had this in the first page.
I'm sure everybody has a book at home where that's the first page, right? But then again, and it's kind of funny because when earlier this morning, I think it was Matt Kramer again who said, when you mentioned, John, he said cold climate is not a thing, but he said it's a new world concept, right? That back in the days, I guess in the old world, and when viticulture was started, they weren't saying, oh, I'm going to make a cool climate wine, right? They were just planting grapes where they were, and the places that have, you know, made a reputation over the years are the ones that consistently produced the better wines year after year. But yeah, there was not that notion of, but yet just the word climate, right? I think most of you would know that it comes from the Greek klima, which means a slope or an inclination. So there's kind of that link to the Burgundian notion of klima, but there's actually a much, much older meaning, still in Greek. I think it's klinen, or a slight variation on klima, but that actually has a notion of latitude. So even the Greeks, you know, 2,000 years ago had that notion of things that could grow in different, so to split the world into, I think they had 7 zones. So based on, so this notion of actually latitude linked to climate and how things can grow has existed for a long time. Maybe we've called them differently, but the effect of solar radiation will have a huge effect on potential for photosynthesis, right? So again, we can zoom in, but I think latitude really defines the initial consideration of where to plant. So 30 to 50, I'll come back to that because there's slight differences between Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere. But so climate is defined by how the sun insolation, how sun energy radiation hits the earth and how it leaves the atmosphere also. And then how air circulates is also dependent on latitude, right? Be it wind, the different winds, the major winds that we find across the globe, or the major ocean currents are also defined by latitude. And these are, so when I say you can't not just take latitude, sorry, obviously then it can be mitigated by altitude, by bodies of water and their currents, by altitude.
I would think most obviously in an example that is pretty banal, but you know, here in Toronto, we're at 42-ish degrees latitude. If you follow that line along, we're in Tuscany, we're in Florence, and we've all been to Florence at different times of the year, and it has nothing to do with the climate here. Obviously, the Gulf Stream is a huge influence. So at that point, does latitude have any meaning?
But even, I would go even further. Yes, it does, but you cannot compare, you cannot take, you know, 44 degrees of latitude in Europe and say 44 degrees of latitude elsewhere in the world will be the same conditions. They are continent specific, at least. They are even hemisphere specific, right? I mean, we say 30 to 40 north and south, but south would probably be, you know, 20 to 40 would be truer to reality than 30 to 50. There's nothing beyond 46 in the south. And even that is very, very recent. I mean, for the longest time, the most southern vineyards were, right, I don't know, 40, 42 for... We've seen a push in the last years in South America and New Zealand
Central
to go.
Otago's at 45.
Yeah,
for
I
example.
think there's a vineyard planted. I think it's is it two paddocks, Sam Neill? I think he has a vineyard just past 46. But he says beyond that, nothing grows, right? So it's really, I mean, 48, 49 seems impossible in both South America and New Zealand. So you can't just transpose from north to south or from one continent to the other, right? And then, of course, there's all the mitigating factors. But I think it's really a solid base to start. It cannot be the only reason why you would choose to plant a vineyard somewhere, but definitely will define, you know, the greatest general area where vine cultivation is possible. And even so, even within those, we find areas. Then there's, you know, we talked about currents and land masses, masses of water. The opposite also, continentality, right? What's interesting in the three regions we're talking about Ontario and Chablis and New Zealand, there's a lot of similarities, right? There's not huge differences in latitudes. None of them are really marked by altitude. Okay, and I would say altitude will come and add an extra layer once you have the right latitude, or it will temper the problems of the wrong latitude, as is the case in the most northerly parts of Chile or Argentina, or vineyards in Bolivia, right, where you're way past, and you're probably at 18 in Bolivia. And in terms of latitude, it's very, in northern Argentina, it goes down to close also 20. Hence the very high altitude, right? And then there's a whole bunch of other factors that comes with altitude. You also change the effect of the sun. You change the effect of the radiation, right? There's something to be said, and I find that in the wines of New Zealand, there it's not altitude, but it's probably the total isolation. But we often refer to a certain brightness in the fruit character, right? And what I like to call in French, de l'éclat, a brightness. Yeah, it's very, which I find in common in very high altitude vineyards or in New Zealand. And in New Zealand, I think it's probably unique in the fact that it's not from very high altitudes, but from just total isolation, right? Less pollution, more direct. So yeah, I do think that latitude definitely is an important factor to consider.
Any comments from Treve or Brad on that? Are you buying what Vero is laying down here?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, I think latitude has to weigh in there. You can have great growing degree days, but you know, you find yourself in Panama. You know, they look good, but your latitude sucks. So you know, you have to weigh that into it. I think it's part of the issue. If you think about latitude and some of the more northern vineyards that we see, you know, there's other elements that they get into, like you know, climate, rain shields, bodies of water that might mitigate your latitude north, possibly. But I think inherently, like, yeah, I mean, daylight, sun hours, intensity of sunlight, I think that warrants effect for the idea of latitude being incorporated on a basic level.
Treve?
No, absolutely. I think latitude is the main sort of base factor for defining, you know, obviously viticulture, cool viticulture. And then when you are not working with maybe ideal latitude, as Vero said, you have to look at other factors that might affect the vineyard, like altitude, like water, like air currents, like wind. That's a huge thing. And of course, when you go up in altitude, the UV has a great effect. So, yeah.
This is all very fascinating. I was expecting this to be the first one to be chucked out as the most useless little tidbit of information. But my question to you then, Vero, is, well, if we're trying to come up with a definition of cool, I don't think that there's a number or a range of numbers for latitude or altitude that we can add into a general definition. It has to be hyper-specific, hyper-local. Would you agree with that?
Totally, yeah. No, I mean, the notion of altitude as a defining factor is in a very, very general, like I said, it's kind of the base stone upon which you build, right? But altitude, because to me, altitude is really not, whereas I find latitude does have a serious importance, altitude does not. Again, if we look just at the 3 specific vineyards we're talking about today, the vineyard regions, Ontario, New Zealand, or Chablis, none of them has high altitude, right? They're all definitely, to me, by far, cool climate. And if I can just finish on, and I'm trying to remember who said it. I think it was again Matt Kramer, but who brought the another thing we were told on very early, right? Was that the best wines are made there where the vine has no guarantee of ripening every year, right? That notion of extreme limit of marginality. Well, again, latitude at much higher latitudes, you will have more vintage variation, which to me is a good thing. And that brings a whole other subject, which we're not touching upon, but the economics of cool climate, right? If making the best wines is working in very marginal places where you do not have the guarantee of a fully ripe and a big production every year, there's serious economics tied in with that.
Well, yes, we tend to overlook that incredibly important side of it because it is the wine business after all. And just a reminder to everyone here that we don't really expect to answer this question definitively, but rather just throw out a number of different points to discuss so that when you're out chatting with winemakers, you have a little bit more vocabulary with which to broach the subject of cool climate. If someone says they're cool, well, now you can ask them what exactly makes them cool. And slowly but surely, maybe we'll come up with a more definite, more succinct definition that we can all kind of agree on. But I really doubt it. Yeah, there are lots of great questions here. There are a lot of things that we're not taking into consideration. We're not even looking at clone and rootstock and age of vines and all sorts of other things. But we had to put some kind of limits on the discussion. Otherwise, we'd run into the evening, and that will run into our Chardonnay cocktail hour, which we don't really want to do. So let's move on to the next topic here. We're going to get Brad into the discussion here, and he's going to talk a little bit about risk of frost. Is that a factor? Winter damage and diurnal shifts. So I'm just going to ask you straight up, Brad, here off the top. Hopefully this is a simple yes or no answer. If a region has a very low incidence of frost damage and no winter damage outside of freak weather events, can they be called cool, or should we be, sending all of the winemakers in cool climates a flag like this to run up their pole? We'll just cut out morale and put in until the climate improves. Is getting beaten up as a wine grower part of the cool climate DNA, or is it not part of it at all?
I think it's a bit tricky, much like all of these questions, but I would say, if I had to pick one or the other, yes or no, I would say yes. You need to have a certain amount of danger in order to procure the amount of excitement you're looking for at a later date when the wine is bottled. If we look viticulturally speaking to any viticultural area, the risk of frost is high. At any time, really, and it can come in hot or cool climates. Regardless, we look like areas of Barossa Valley, very warm climate area, or Napa Valley. We've seen recent frosts through there, 2019 in Barossa, 2008 in Napa, but they tend to be a bit more spread out and a bit more variable, where you expect them because you have to, because it's millions and millions of dollars in there, so you have to prepare for them, but you may not get them, such as Napa doesn't get frost every year, certainly as a major event. Whereas you look into areas like Chablis, as we're discussing today, when interviewing winemakers like Didier, William Fair, Van Vincent from Diurnal Shifts, the conversation of frost was everywhere. They talk about frost very regularly. It's a very reoccurring event that takes place within their lives. They're constantly in fear of it, even though it might not decimate. They live with the idea of it. And same with New Zealand. Look at Wairarapa. Paddy Brockwork, said, we fear frost all the time. It's a regular day occurrence to it. And you see that tasting through the wines, tasting through Hannah Morrison's Villa Maria here, Taylor's Pass, lovely juice. In Marlborough, she states that frost is all the time and would be happy to run amok without the intervention of viticulturists and winemakers. So to compare that, I mean, when we see the flavor elements that emerge from cooler climate, we do tend to see that relationship with frost more so often than with warmer areas. So I think, yes, I would say that if you live in terror of fear of the frost, then you're probably in an area that is producing cooler climate wines. And that's the factor of like weather and correlation between frost tendencies in the season and when the vines wake up. Like for example, in Napa, when you have bud burst regularly between end of February and March, the temperature's already warm enough in that area to usually stave off frost unless it's a weird episode. Whereas if you're looking at Chablis, for example, you're dealing with that type of activity in April and May, where you still have cooler climates that are rising. And then with the onset of a full moon in May, you may tend to run the risk of frost at that particular time. So I think there's a definite correlation between frost activity, frost danger, and the idea of a cool climate viticultural area. Absolutely.
Fascinating answer. So then we should have flags like this made up for all of those poor bona fide cool climate winemakers, right? And I mean, that could be a nice sign to anyone driving by. Say, okay, that's a cool climate region. Look at that. They're waving the flag. Yeah, and it's worth remembering that Chardonnay is an early budding variety. We know it's a short cycle variety. That's why it works in cool climates, but it buds early, which is problematic when spring temperatures are warm. Just mention the vintage 2015 to Ontario wine growers, and they'll probably cringe because there's a pretty severe frost episode in May of that year that has severe economic consequences, as Vera was pointing out. We have to keep that in mind as part of the discussion. Interesting. I thought that one would be tossed out, but you've made a pretty strong argument for that, Brad. Well done. Vero, oui.
Yeah. No, I can even add on to that. And it's true. I mean, obviously the winemakers in Chablis talk a lot about the frost, but both Grégory Viennois from La Roche and I was speaking with Athénaïs de Beru also. And right off the bat, they say, is latitude a defining factor? No, continentality is. And by continentality, they mean those big, big changes in seasons and in diurnal temperatures also, but very much in season. And so, Brad, that goes exactly to, right? That implies risks of frost.
Yeah.
And yeah, they've paid dearly for it. But Athénaïs was saying, we were talking about the 20 vintage, and she was saying, I think it's the first time in 20 years that we have three solid vintages in a row. Three.
Thank goodness, because it was getting a little tight on supply there for a while after 15, 16. All right, so we're going to shelve that on the side of we'll keep that. You have to expect some beatings if you are in a genuine cool climate. But let's move on to diurnal shifts here, Brad. I'd like you to talk a little bit about this. And my statement to you is that the majority of cool climate cultivars, Chardonnay included, achieve greater typicity in regions with higher diurnal temperature ranges. So that means daytime temperatures that are high enough to facilitate ripening, while nighttime temperatures are low enough to slow respiration, that is acid degradation, and metabolism. And these conditions bring about more typical characteristics that we associate with cool climate Chardonnay. Are you going to argue for or against diurnal shift?
I'm going to say no. Initially, looking at the science and the data, and just looking at the diurnal swings, cool climates tend to run into the normal degree of diurnal on the planet, which is roughly 10 degrees. Really, where you see wide diurnal spreads are, where you see a shift away from 10 degrees is if it's a lower altitude towards water. For example, in this case, Marlborough has a relatively low diurnal swing. We really see around 8 degrees being quite normal in that area. Whereas if we look toward extreme areas like dry, hot, desert, that's when we begin to see the extremities of it. I gave you a chart there, John.
Just pulling it up for you here. There we are.
That looks. So, we see the pink there being the highs and the purples being the lows, of course. This is courtesy of weatherandclimate.com, great website for climate data. We see in areas like Dijon, Niagara Falls, and Nelson, we see those temperatures really having a diurnal shift of about 10 degrees, 10 to 11 within those categories. When we move into hot climates, we're using Sacramento around Amador County here as a hot climate. This is where we really begin to see big diurnal shifts of like 20 degrees. If we look at, again, to reference Napa Valley, in the summertime, they can have a 20-degree diurnal shift between nighttime and daytime temperatures ranging from 34 degrees Celsius in the daytime in July and August down to 15 during the nighttime. Barossa Valley, another warm climate, we typically see a diurnal range of around 15 to 16 degrees during the growing season. These are average numbers, of course, not including high spikes in either one of these areas. Whereas when we look at, we look at cool climate areas, Niagara typically tends to have that kind of 10 degrees. Chablis is a firm 10 degrees. Without looking at extremes like Central Otago, which can have 30 or 35 degree diurnal shifts, most cool climate falls in that 10 degrees. So when we talk about diurnal extravagance in cool climate and how it shapes it, I would have to say no. I mean, looking at the data and the graphs, no, actually it's relatively boring that diurnal, it is consistent around that 10 degree mark.
Even though Burgundy there and Nelson, New Zealand, Niagara Falls, you've got data from there, it's all similar. We all consider those cool climate regions. Still, that's just a coincidental factor rather than a defining factor of their coolness.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we talk about diurnal a lot, and it is extremely important, I think, in places like, say, for example, Napa Valley, where you need that reprieve at nighttime in order for those acids to be retained, the metabolic definition to be defined, and for the wines to be balanced. But in a more marginal climate, where we're looking at it, it's obviously still important, but because the grapes, the climate naturally are going to have that more extreme kind of nature towards that more reserved, detailed elegance or profile inherently to it, one could argue that maybe because the diurnal is around 10, which is boring, it's very normal on the planet, that maybe it's not a considering factor in it, really, as a defining moment. So I would say you could argue no.
All right, I'm putting it on the no side unless the nodding Treve has anything to say in support of diurnal.
No, I totally agree. Diurnal shift is important for sure, absolutely. But as a definition for cool climate, that's not showing so.
I agree with Brad. I think it's more of a saving grace in a hotter climate. Helps to produce, it's one of those mitigating factors that when you're not necessarily in the right latitude, it might help. But yeah, not on its own, definitely not. I think it's just because we tend to associate it with maybe more acid retention, and acidity being kind of something we associate with how we would describe a cool climate wine. We tend to just give it more importance maybe than it should have.
All right, so kind of like altitude, it can save you if you're in the wrong spot, or if you want to find a cool spot in a spot that's otherwise, a region that otherwise is not so cool. Okay, fabulous.
It could be on flavor development though, huh? By the way, I don't know if we want to go there.
Let's stay on the rails, shall we? You got a couple more things to get through. All right, I'd like to make a couple of arguments for all of you. Let's see if we agree or disagree. And I'm going to talk about sunshine hours, length of growing season. That's you can calculate it a number of different ways, whether that's the average number of days between bud break and harvest, or flowering and harvest, or frost-free days. They're not all quite the same thing. I'm going to look at specifically flowering to harvest for Chardonnay because I found some interesting results there. But first on sunshine hours, I think this is something that 20 years ago we would not have been discussing in relation to cool at all, or rather it was always a desperate search for more sunshine in order to squeeze out that little extra bit of ripeness in areas that were certainly on the edge, where you could not be assured of a crop every year, as Matt said this morning. But I believe it's become a pretty critical factor in the whole discussion here. And light is, of course, critical. Without it, there wouldn't be all that biological activity, the physiological functions like photosynthesis and development, biosynthesis of phenolic substances in the berry. But, I would like to point out some negative effects of light nowadays. And I'm going to bring out the question that I love to ask, which is being asked more and more around the world: is sunshine the new rain? And think about that for a second. It used to be that rain was the most feared thing. It's what would ruin your harvest year after year. Whereas now I think growers are increasingly fearing sunshine, too much sunshine, particularly if they're looking to make a classic cool climate style as we're trying to define it. And so in extreme cases, when you've got both high temperatures and high light conditions, you actually can impair your physiological functions, right? Flowering and berry growth can all be disrupted. And even obviously in really warm climates, the vine just shuts down altogether and you get no more photosynthesis and just shriveling of unripe berries, which is a generally unhappy thing by the time it reaches your glass. So that's why I think areas with really high UV light and parts of Mendoza, Argentina come to mind. I think it's tough to consider those cool because you've got heat and abundant sunshine and super high UV. So altitude alone, in this case, Vero, I don't think is sufficient to call it a genuinely cool climate. Yes, you mitigate the heat to some degree, but you're not going to achieve cool climate status, in my opinion, in any case. And then in the search for cool, I mean, we have to keep in mind that sunshine is a major source of heat, right? Solar radiation or insolation is the number one thing that heats up berries. Great berries, cluster temperatures are dominated during the day by solar radiation and the intensity of sunlight that's reaching the fruit. And I'm going to pull out a fancy term here that I'm going to use at my next cocktail party: photon flux density. Isn't that a cool thing to say? Photon flux density. That's just a measure of how much light is hitting a surface per unit per time, unit area per time. And that, coupled with temperature, has a synergistic effect, which is to say, if you've got a really hot moment, a little heat event, a heat wave, as it were, coupled with lots of sunshine, you are going to get much higher berry temperatures. And berry temperature can exceed air temperature by as much as 10 to 15 degrees, which is really quite extraordinary if you think about that. And the difference of what's happening in a berry at that temperature versus one 15 degrees less is enormous. It changes the game entirely. So, your entire metabolism changes, and that means in berries under lower temperatures you get more slow sugar accumulation. That sugar loading happens much more slowly, therefore grapes ripen a little bit later. Acids are metabolized more slowly, less respiration, so you maintain that acids that we've been talking about, and you retain higher concentrations of organic acids and more soluble solids. So all in all, lower temperatures without passing beneath that critical threshold are generally a good thing. The inverse is true in really high temperatures. So I would contend that if we're going to agree that acidity is an important part of cool, you can't have ultra hot grapes, you can't have too much sunshine. And just to throw a couple of numbers out there for relative context, if we're looking at Niagara area, actually this is information from Hamilton, so it's not precise, but it's not that far away. You're looking at about 2,100 sunshine hours per year. Over in Prince Edward County, it's a little bit less, about 1,950 odd. In France, in Dijon, Chablis, you're looking at 1,800. Wairarapa, so south end of the North Island in New Zealand, just over 1,900. So essentially we're looking at 1,900 to 2,100 total sunshine hours in what I'm going to call your more typical cool climate. There are some areas with a little bit more, like say Gisborne or Hawke's Bay. I've got a Hawke's Bay wine here from Teawanga. Where is it gone? So, I mean, that's generally considered a slightly warmer area in New Zealand. Cabernet ripens nicely there, so does Syrah, but Chardonnay is also grown there. For me, it's a little bit warmer in style, and that's because sunshine hours are a little bit higher, 2180, according to my research. But, there are some other parts of New Zealand that have even more sunshine hours. Look at Marlborough, look at Nelson. You're at 2,400 sunshine hours per year. Why aren't they growing Cabernet and Syrah? Well, here comes the other important factor. We've all kind of touched on it a little bit, but air movement or wind is critical, right? So sunshine is the number one thing that heats up a berry, but wind or air movement or convection currents is the number one thing that can cool berries under normal daytime conditions. And if you think of where Marlborough, Nelson are, well, they're right on the edge of the Cook Strait, the bay there, very cold waters, so the winds coming off that bay are cool, and for me works synergistically to cool the otherwise very sunny regions that Marlborough and Nelson are. Brings to mind Alsace. That was mentioned this morning as a cool climate. For me, it's kind of on the edge of cool because it's the second sunniest place in France. If you look at the stats, in Colmar, it's only second to Perpignan. So very sunny, but you're also in the Rhine River Valley and you have a lot of side valleys coming out of the Vosges Mountains, which bring in cool air. So you get a moderating effect. But nonetheless, you get pretty ripe Gewürztraminer and Pinot Gris flavors there. Interesting that Nelson also makes such terrific aromatic varieties. For me, there's a parallel between cool and sunshine, light without heat, as it were. So I think that's really my argument on that side. Would anyone like to join in? Sunshine, a little is necessary, but too much is tough. Just one more example over in Argentina, talking about winds, or even Southern Europe where it's sunny. They have lots of wind. In Argentina, there's the Zonda, but it's a hot wind. So it's not enough to be windy, it has to be a cool wind. So you don't get the moderating effect of a cool wind in Argentina. You don't get it with the Scirocco coming out of Africa, because that's Africa hot, and it's not going to do much to counteract the high sunshine hours. General agreement? Vero, you're looking nonplussed by my argument there. Can you unmute yourself, unless you intentionally left yourself muted?
Sorry.
Were you swearing?
No, I was just nodding about the winds, right? It's so hugely important, just as much as the currents, right? The winds in the water and the winds above. But the Mistral in France, right, is a perfect example. But yeah, I really like that notion of light without heat. I think that's actually probably one of the better, very concise ways of describing what cool climate would be. I think it encompasses a lot of what we touched upon. But yeah, the importance of enough energy from the sun, but without, you know, I mean, look at so many, and even cool climates, you know, the incidences of des blocages de maturité.
When the vine shuts down, essentially.
When they shut down, right? I mean, you end up, you know, and so to have that amount of sun without excessive heat, I think but probably more and more difficult to get. No, but I think it's probably a common thing to all the climates we're talking about. Chablis, not so far from Beaune, right? But Beaune is in the Saône River corridor, so it gets, you know, there's some heat coming up from whereas in Chablis, it's more open to winds coming from the north. Mm-hmm. From Scandinavia, more, right? So two places very close by with different winds have completely different influences.
Chablis is not particularly windy, I wouldn't say, although you do get breezes, but the fact is it's not that sunny. You know, There's only 1,800 hours of sunshine per year, which means a lot of cloud cover, and cloud cover is not a bad thing if you're searching for cool, right?
Yeah.
Same with Ontario, you know. Decent enough sunshine hours, but constant breeze coming off of Lake Ontario, coupled with that air movement, you get moderating effect of, you know, it gets pretty hot. It's 30 degrees here today. It's always the hottest weekend of the year, although I don't think that's true this i4C weekend. Any other comments from Treve on sunshine?
I was just going to add, for a lot of people in Ontario, right? I mean, we didn't mention it, but it's the elephant in the room. It's the lake, or the lakes and the river, right? There's the continentality, but the great moderating effects of the lake is probably an essential part of what defines Niagara's terroir. Sorry, Treve.
No, that's fine. I was just thinking about the light without heat and how important it is when you're in a marginal cooler climate region. Like I know in New Zealand, Craggy Range and Atarangi, we're doing some tests with crushing oyster shells and putting them in the vineyards to, obviously reflect sunlight back up to the vines, but not heat. It's that searching for extra sunlight without overcooking, overheating, overworking the grapes, in a very delicate, sort of precise way.
And last word on this to you, Brad.
Yeah, I think a conversation about sunlight is always obviously important, but then all the surrounding elements around it as to how that sunlight is incorporated into the vines and incorporated into the wines, such as moderating effects like river, ocean, lake, winds. Obviously, if you're adding oyster shells to your vineyard, obviously important ways. I don't think you can discuss it alone. It much like a lot of these topics, it has to be characterized by something else. Because if it's desert and it's hot and there's no wind, and a lot of sunshine and no cloud, then yes, for sure, that could be direct. But I think in the areas, as you mentioned, Alsace, yes, really sunny area, but there's mountains and lots of valleys that really play into scope of what sunlight can deliver. And then I like your point about cloud cover. Is it cloudy? Yes, in Chablis it is, and that shows distinctly, in the wine. So perhaps an element there for sure.
Well, I would say that unlike Latitude, we could probably put an upper limit on sunshine hours for all of the world's cool climate regions. I don't know what that number would be, probably somewhere around 2,500. When you get up into that range, you have to have some other mitigating factors, but you don't have cool climate regions with 3,000 hours of sunshine a year, at least not that I've come across. So maybe it could enter into the discussion. We could complicate things further by adding that you can, with canopy management, kind of fake cloud cover, if you will. You can reduce the amount of solar radiation, but just by keeping a heavy canopy, that introduces all sorts of other problems. But I would argue against that simply because everyone in the region would have to be doing the same thing for the region as a whole, in a macro sense, to be called cool climate. Yes, you can have a fellow making cool climate wines in an otherwise hot region by manipulating canopy, but that doesn't make it a cool climate region. Would that be fair to say? All right, let me throw one last thing out there. My grand unifying theory, always a dangerous thing to do. Maybe something that will encompass everything we've been talking about today and get us a little bit closer to a definition of cool climate that maybe we can all agree on, unlikely as that may be. And I'm going to pin my hopes on the length of the growing season. And as I said, I'm going to use the measure of flowering to harvest. And I would contend that you can't rightly call yourself a cool climate growing region if you're growing a grape that is at the lower end or the shorter end of the typical span in which it ripens. And every grape variety has a different ripening cycle. In the case of Chardonnay, from my research, we're looking at about, I'm going to pin my number right there at 100 days from flowering, about 50% flowering, to harvest. Now, I also have to add into the fact that you have to harvest at a certain degrees of bricks, and I'm going to arbitrarily pick 23 bricks as the upper limit of cool climate. Even that maybe is debatable. Just to put that in relative context, that's just under 13% potential alcohol. That is about the minimum that you need for Grand Cru Chablis, and it's about what they're harvesting Chardonnay at down in most parts of New Zealand. Obviously generalizing here hugely, but once you go above that, you're no longer in cool climate. As Dan Sullivan from Prince Edward County was commenting the other day, he said, if your Chardonnay is ripening at 26 degrees bricks, you're not in the right place if you're trying to make cool climate wine. And the contentious part of that sentence is ripening. What does that mean? And that for me means, well, you wouldn't have to add any acid. Your fruit character is still in that crunchy, fresh, green, vibrant, citrusy, not the peach pie end of the Chardonnay spectrum. And you don't really have to mess around with anything else in the winery. So you need a minimum of 100 days to reach 21, 22 degrees bricks, at which point the vigneron is wiping her brow saying, thank God we got there, because it was touch and go, as it is every year, to reach that minimum ripeness that we need to make wines of deliciousness, not those, what did Andrew say? These lean, mean, caustic, skinny, unpleasant, undrinkable wines. Nobody wants that. Even cool has to be pleasurable. and I think you can reach that. So that's my grand unifying definition, up for arguments on either side. Can we use length of growing season for Chardonnay as a definition?
I like that length. I like the constraints of nature on either side of that argument to constrict. You have that natural constriction that takes place where, you know, danger lurks, you know, in the beginning and rears its head at the end. And you don't have an ability to extend that viticulture practice to your own flavor profile or to your own agenda. You know, visiting vineyards in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where it was deep sand and heavily irrigated, they were the most relaxed farmers I think I've ever seen, because they started when they wanted to, and then they would ripen for a while, and then they would look at it, and then they would harvest when they turned off the water. And it was pretty easy going. It was a very relaxing trip to be on. But I think you're right of having that the 100 days in there, wherever that 100 days happens to fall. In order to be kind of cool climate is an area that I think needs to be taken in consideration to have it. You know, you have to have the danger in the excitement.
And by the way, I'll just point out that all of the regions and countries that we're talking about fall in that range. Chablis, I got the numbers for 2019, which was a warm vintage, maybe even a hot vintage, but there it was 101 days, again, on average. So even in a hot vintage, we can't forget we're in a cool region. So for everywhere else in the world, it would be still considered a pretty cool region. In Niagara, we're averaging, I spoke to Jim Wilworth at Covey, and he said, yes, about 100 days is right. Some seasons it's a little bit longer, sometimes it's a little bit shorter, but I found it very interesting to correlate that for me, one of my favorite Ontario vintages, 2017 for Chardonnay, it was spectacular across the board, also happened to have one of the longer periods between flowering and harvest, about 105 days. That has to have something to do with the deliciousness of those wines. And parts of New Zealand actually stretch a little bit further than that. The Teawanga that I was tasting a moment ago, that was, how many days did I calculate here? Somewhere between 100 and 120 in Hawke's Bay. In any case, 2019 was a warmer season, shorter. And actually, to be honest, not to beat up on this wine, I find the flavors a little bit less developed than I would have expected for Hawke's Bay. Again, you can always harvest early and hit 22 bricks, but if you don't have the full flavor development, then it's not, for me, the cool climate. Full flavor development in that long period of time. Treve Ring.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a factor that should be talked about more, and maybe it will be. Maybe when people start thinking about the growing season in this way and looking at these parameters, I think it's an excellent base for talking about cool climate. Especially with Chardonnay, specifically with Chardonnay.
Vero?
As long as people are still aiming for balance, right? The eternal most important word when talking about any wine, because you can have a super long season and it's quite warm and you let it hang too long, and right, that's not going to. Maybe also a criteria that's kind of linked to that is that the best cool climates regions, for Chardonnay in particular, are areas that are able to have this long growing season with conditions that allow the grapes to retain all of their acidity or great levels of acidity. Right? And I think that's a defining factor in all three countries, regions we're talking about, that even through certain warmer seasons or longer, there's something either from the soils, from the specific microclimate, but that allows the grapes to retain high levels of acidity. So you have full flavor development, full aromatics, great balance, and still refreshing acids.
I think we've just concluded what everyone has already known for many centuries in a very roundabout way. But there we have it. I think that's where we knew we would expect to end up. So thanks to you all for all of your thoughts. We've got a little bit of time. Yes, Magdalena is back, maybe with a few audience questions. And maybe you could all just flash what wines you've been sipping away in the background there.
Yeah, so maybe actually I could challenge you all with a question. And again, I kind of did it on the last session. We are, really kind of focusing today on 3 cool climate regions, and you each have 2 wines from each region, New Zealand, Chablis, and Ontario. And so this could be difficult, this could be easy. Well, I guess the first thing is, I love the fact that we've been able to bring the international context to this session, to I4C with this session, which is what the spirit of I4C is. Also that science matters, which we all know. And I think this session today has made science accessible, and maybe not the average consumer may be that interested, but I think all of us in the community that are winemakers, sommeliers, wine writers, marketers, that this all matters to us. It makes us it makes us learn more, understand more. And so what I'm hoping that you each can do is maybe just chat about, with the wines that you've tasted. I guess my question is twofold. Is when you're tasting the New Zealand, when you're tasting the Ontario, when you're tasting the Chablis, not necessarily to compare them to each other, and maybe you want to, but is there anything that strings the 2 wines together for you from each region that you can share? I mean, I guess it gets back to that whole question of, if these wines were blind, what is it to you that kind of makes you look for this character in that region? Assuming that we agree that they're all essentially cool climate, and trying to dig beyond kind of like maybe how, unoaked, oaked, and those kind of things. So I don't know if that's a complex question, but if you can each try to tackle that.
Of course, it's a very simple question. Listen, I'm going to start off, and I'll be very, very short, very simple. The factor that links all of these wines is, as I said earlier, that fruit character, which varies, and I'm not talking about winemaking at all here, completely irrelevant and not related to, but just pure degree of ripeness at harvest of the fruit. All of these wines fall from the citrus to the just ripe orchard fruit spectrum, to be very specific, never moving beyond that, never moving into overripe, into dried, into jammy, nothing like that. And coupled with that is a very natural acidity, and by natural I mean one that seems to jive with the character of the fruit. There's one way for me to tell when a wine has been manipulated or adjusted in acid, is when the fruit character doesn't match the acid. You can have really jammy fruit flavors and high acid. It's easy to achieve in the winery, but it can't be natural. I mean, that's why I say it's an unnatural balance in the wine. And for me, all of these wines, even from slightly warmer, slightly cooler regions, slightly warmer vintages and cooler vintages, all retain that character of fruit and that level of natural, very comfortable, ripe acidity, not lean and mean, but it works. And that's, I guess, what we're talking about when we mention harmony and balance.
Yeah, I would agree with John. When you look at removing the winemaking styles, they quite varied, certainly in the 6 wines that I have in front of me. You really do look to the fruit profile, the certain degree of ripeness, where the acid sits, and where it feels they're all quite fresh wines, of course, and show great vibrancy to it, but they do have their own individual characters of where that acid falls, where the fruit sits. And I think that's a key indicator between where all the wines come from as an identifier, looking to remove winemaking from it. As John said, it's pretty hard to remove the flavor of the grape that you've harvested, even through winemaking. So I think it's a true characteristic to look for.
Yeah, I think when I was tasting through all these wines, what links them together, for me, like Szabo said, it's just a vibrant, natural acidity. It's everything is in place. It's very streamlined and sleek, but it's not tart. It's not angry. It's not mean, and it's not blousy and flabby. There's a beautiful, fresh, vibrant, natural acidity that runs through all of these, and they're from completely different soils and completely different winemaking styles. But that is something that you can't fake and you can't achieve in non-cool climate regions.
Mm-hmm. I'd go on to add my microphone on. I had wines that were ranging in alcohol from 12% to 14%. 12, 12 and a half, 13, 13 and a half, 14. So this is great, over 6 wines. None of them they were all harmonious, right? Again, that natural acidity. And I think probably the one at 14 was more like 13.7, but still no sense of heat, beautiful. And you know, we often qualify Chardonnay as being kind of a great canvas for terroir, right? Because it has a bit of that neutrality. And there was that, when it's done well, there can be a sense of purity, right? That you were kind of referring to. There's a sense of purity of all of them have attention, and even some, right, like the 18s from Ontario from warmer vintages, or a great sense of purity, of tension. And I don't want to take anything away from terroir or the notion of cool climate, but we also have, I'll just throw it in there, I'll let John finish with that, but obviously as much depends on your climate as it does on viticulture and winemaking, right? There's a lot of, you know, we see in more and more reductive styles of winemaking. I see it in a lot of the wines that I had today, which I love. We could have a whole other conversation about how does that detract or not from the expression of terroir, but it definitely adds to that notion of, nobody said the M word, minerality, right? There's this salinity in a lot of the wines I tried today. And to me, that's very also kind of that notion of purity and of letting the terroir shine through. At least that's what we like to think.
And while I agree 100% with you, just to defend the good work that we've done here today, you're perfectly correct. The human factor is primordial. However, we're talking about potential of a region and whether it's cool climate. After that, what you do individually in your winery, or if you happen to have the south facing or the north facing hill, then that's a different discussion. But if we're looking in general, can we conclude that Chablis, Ontario, all parts, and New Zealand, all parts, fall under the cool climate definition as we've come up with it?
Totally. And sorry, I'm going to try to shut me up. Andrew Jefford this morning said, cool climate is not enough. It's what you do with it. But it's the first step towards, I was going to say to all expressions. No, maybe not, but anyhow, yeah. So I think we've come around to a.
Yeah, I would suggest if you're aiming for a cool climate style, you have to start in a cool climate, to state the obvious, but there are plenty of wines, plenty of places around the world we've tasted where they're attempting to make the Chablis style, but that's not what their place wants to give. It's not the comfortable net end result of what they should be making. So don't force your nature, or nature in general.
Yeah, I agree.
So I think, oh, sorry, Brad, you got to go.
Oh, I was just saying I agree.
Okay.
Do we want to answer any questions, or are we going to wrap things up? Magdalena, what do you think?
I think, to be quite honest, again, I want to thank all of the people that attended. We had a really great audience, just like this morning, who stayed on the whole time and asked a ton of amazing questions. And in fact, as I look at those questions, some of them were early on and they really did get answered throughout the session. What it also says to me is that there's a lot of interest in more questions, which is a great thing. And so, you know, maybe you send notes to the panelists who are on here today, or any of us, to just help, you know, or send you to the right people that can ask those questions. I think we all, as people who work in the wine industry, the more questions that we ask when we visit winemakers, we say, why are you doing that? And the other term is, who cares? Because that's where it's kind of like, it's not only why you're doing it, but who would care about why you're doing it? And that really gets you into that deeper reasoning, which is really fun. So I just want to thank everyone on the panel today. It's been amazing. I also want to thank all the producers who provided wine to each of you from each of the 3 countries, New Zealand, Chablis, and Ontario, so that you could have those for comparison, and hopefully people were able to purchase some things and taste along. I just wanted to, before I just do a little toast, I just wanted to, because I kind of fumbled on the description of what's happening tomorrow, is that we have the, and I'm looking at some kind of slideshow on my Instagram, which is changing in front of me. So it is i4C at home, which is a challenge that we have that's been going on all week, and you can still participate today, tomorrow, and into Sunday. So do a little quick post of your favorite cool climate Chardonnay and maybe a quick pairing, whether it's a beautiful recipe that you're making that you've read about on our website and you're inspired to make, or if it's just something simple. You just need to post that. The rules are on our website, and you could win some amazing prizes, actually, prizes that I would love to win, but I cannot actually enter, sadly. So, and also tomorrow night at 6 o'clock, we also have a Toast to Chardonnay, our Zoom call. That's just going to be, again, a much more casual, fun way to celebrate. So please join in for that. And so I'm just going to get my glass of Chardonnay to make a toast and say thank you very much for a great School of Cool. I think my glass is in the vineyard. You see how my glass came right out?
It's ethereal. It's transparent,
So cool.
Chardonnay.
So cheers, everyone, and have a wonderful Friday and a great weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to you all.
Thank
Have
you
a
so
great
much.
weekend.